in things like capital regulation. You see Bank of England just in consultation right now on climate stress tests. It's early days. We just responded. So they need to have more fixed scenarios and things. But the general principle that from a quantitative basis, climate change, the curve of the climate, if you were to plot out the available carbon budget, the more carbon we put into the atmosphere, if we're going to ever, be able to have a world that we live on, the steeper the drop off that we're going to need at a certain point in the future when we work it. And that means that you get the more that we keep on going to that point, the more dramatic the impact on the banking sector, the higher the proportion of stranded assets and all of those sort of things. That's something which is feeling like it's coming anyway when you can quantify it, because there are graphs of carbon, there are different discussion. There's ways of being able to run those numbers. The same is not true of social issues or other issues where there's they're more unpredictable events. So they're predictable surprises. So things like if antibiotic resistance, or like what would that call, or like patterns of migration or major disruptions. It's like how you deal with those things are inherently more difficult. And what you see in the progress of European sustainable finance is that all the taxonomy, the focus is on environmental and on quantifiable environmental. So you have threshold levels for certain things in grams per CO2. All of this sort of stuff which is very precise. Because social factors are more qualitative, more relative, and subjective. It's like, well, can we ignore that for now? And let's just do these bits, and we'll do that in a phase 2. Yep. We interpret that to mean we'll put that to the long grass. If the European Union ever has time to do that, it'll be doing pretty well. So how do we get to really enshrining the stuff which can be embedded into capital requirements, and the climate stuff needs to be really soon. And I'll run through the argument on the specific relationship which we'll be envisaging, and then going on to the other factors like social. That's number one. The second one is looking at purpose and having the regulatory dialogue go further than you broke the rules. Here's your checklist, and you broke 2 out of 75 or whatever. The allegorical story would be like a parole officer for people leaving prison. Parole officers in the UK context, and actually in several other contexts, they're kind of there to help support you as you come out and rebuild life and do all these other things. And yet, if you don't report to them, they're the people who can make one phone call and you're back in prison. Playing both those roles is really quite difficult. And at the moment, the regulator is kind of in that secondary role. It's we can slap you on the wrist. As it turns out, they can't really send bankers to prison because they don't. But that's still the electric fence kind of function that's being played. If you want to improve the culture of banking towards something which is genuinely serving society better, you need to develop that more primary relationship of what is your bank here to do? What do you do? It's like, and to really get under the skin of purpose. Not a synthetic purpose which you manufacture and discover after the fact of like, once we've taken care of the profit, this is what we can say our purpose is, but really what the purpose is. Because understanding that is going to give a much more enriched picture on risk management, on undiscovered latent risks, on some of those things which the reports are not necessarily going to give you, and it will lead to enhanced levels of sophistication and regulation.
If it's money, money, as it is for many banks, because they are corporates, they are companies, the primary, If it's just that bottom line, how would it inform those risks and so on that you're talking about?
If it's just money, then generally it's like then better you do rely upon incredibly well executed rules and routines and procedures in order to be safe.
Yeah.
If it's not just money, through the dialogue you might recognise that there are some other forces which, although are not as easy to quantify, don't currently come up into the report. You could build an evidence base for how actually, so the support of communities around the projects which are being lent to, it's a real thing. Mm-hmm. It's not just it's seen as a soft factor, but it's seen as a soft factor because there's not the metrics to capture it.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily want the conclusion of that to be, then you want metrics to capture it, because then the way that flows down could pollute the entire relationships upon why that social capital is there in the first place. Social capital, natural capital are things which exist, but you have to tap into them in a different way. The story which is used here is like, in order to measure a plant, what you don't want to do is pull it up from its roots, then measure it, and then plonk it back, because you kill the plant in doing it. And it's a similar thing. It's about extending that dialogue, so enacting beyond the electric fence. And then the third point is disclosure and transparency, because the more that banks are opening up, the more natural forces can come into play in terms of regulation. The more that they become accountable to society at the behest of regulators, the more society will keep them in check. Banks like some in South America, where the loan officer turns up in the same 5 blocks every single day, it's like, that's a really natural mechanism. That person is not, from a consumer protection point of view, is far less likely to play fast and loose with one of his clients, because he's got to turn up the next day. He's not going to stand there and then sort of be criticised by the whole of that neighbourhood. So being able to be open, to be accountable, and the primary mechanisms of disclosure and transparency allow you to do it, means that it becomes easier to have more natural ways of banks going in a direction where they're more socially useful and purposed.
Right. Interesting. So just to sum up, first the environmental factors into quant, then various qualitative measures, more emphasis on that within the social field, and then transparency and accountability. Would you agree that some time ago the banks would emphasize more transparency, accountability first, and perhaps environmental? In other words, what I'm saying,
values-based banks or banks
banks in general, or banks in this field. Because what I'm finding interesting now is your emphasis on those qualitative mechanisms, especially in light of GBV actually in the scorecard taking that approach as well. More emphasis on qualitative is also more time consuming. You don't capture it through statistics. You need a conversation and so on.
Sure.
This is just my observation, this is what I'm noticing. But I agree with you. Just one comment, 10 years or 20 years ago, not many people agreed on the environmental factors. We had to come to that.
Sure.
Maybe it's easier because it's quantifiable.
Yeah.
And maybe this is the next, to some extent, but maybe it's the next challenge, that qualitative trust relationships.
I mean, we're not there yet on that first one. TCFD, the Task Force
for
Financial Disclosures, the premise was still direct financial risk. So do you as the bank take the loss? And that's very different from systemic risk and your contribution to systemic risk. So I've been on the board of UNFFI. And I had the papers around things like drought risk.